liking the music? This is William Prince. It's the single called Seven, like the number seven. I really like him. So, before we get back to thinking about milk, which is where we're going to go in the end of this module, I want to take a moment to think a little more about Fad's allelic variation while your brain is still thinking about fatty acids and cardiovascular disease. So, the CDC statistics on heart disease are often broken down by race. So, for all people in the United States, 630,000 Americans die from heart disease each year. Basically, 1 in 4 deaths, well, prior to the COVID pandemic, 1 in 4 deaths were from heart disease. Breaking this down by what they call race, by these categories that we use, American Indian or Alaskan Natives, about 18.4% of deaths are due to heart disease. About 22% in Asians or Pacific Islanders. About close to 24% in non-Hispanic blacks. And about 24% as well in non-Hispanic whites. But that said, African American people are 30% more likely to die from heart disease in the United States. And 80% of African Americans have FADS alleles that are more efficient converting short-chain PUFAs to long-chain PUFAs. So that said, in June 2005, the Food and Drug Administration approved a drug called Bidil to treat self-identified black people with congestive heart failure. And Bidil became the standard of care in the treatment of heart failure in people who self-identified as black. Now, Bidil is not a new drug, but rather a combination of 2 drugs that have been on the market for a long time. And when Bidil was first developed as a treatment to prevent heart failure, regardless of ethnicity, the FDA actually rejected approval for the combination drug because there wasn't evidence that showed it actually worked any differently. Now, the cardiologist who ran the study went back to the data, and he found that if he pulled out the results for people who identified as African American at the time, that there was a significant and positive effect. And so then, another drug company got involved, bought the patent, and decided to run a new study. So, the other study that they conducted compared black people taking the combination drug Bidil with black people who were taking a placebo. And here you can see the results, that the people who were on the combination drug did much better. They had lower mortality than the people who were not on the drug Bidil. So the combination drug was much more effective than a placebo. So the FDA, of course, approved the drug, and with that, our first race-based drug was on the market, and it continues to be the standard of care for people who identify as black. Now, quite a few people have some serious concerns with this study. Not so much that there's a drug that helps improve people's survival with cardiovascular disease. I mean, that's a really good thing. But they're concerned about the framing, that this is targeted to people who are black. So did you catch that the study had people self-identify and then assumed that self-identification comes along with significant genetic and physiological differences? Now, I want to get you thinking about some other things in the United States that correlate with self-identification of race. I pulled data from the Kaiser Family Foundation's website, where you can look at poverty by race and ethnicity and state from 2008 to 2018. Now, on this trend graph that I show here, I've included the percentage of black, Hispanic, and white people who are living in poverty. People who identify as white are indicated by circles, and I've highlighted that line with the blue arrow here. People who identify as Hispanic are indicated with triangles. And I'll show that here. So the white people, for the white line, the people who identify as white, poverty hovers around 10%. And the poverty rate in the Hispanic population fluctuates between about 20 to 25%. So it's much higher than what you see for the white population. Now, the black poverty rate is indicated by the yellow arrow at the top. And you can see that there. The poverty rate in this population in the United States was around 25%, ranging from a high close to 30% and a low of about 22%. Now, a very important thing to know about poverty is that it is very bad for your health. A model published a couple of years ago found that an increase in poverty rate by 1 unit, by 1%, is associated with an increase of 2.1% in the death rate from cardiovascular disease. So let's go back to these data. The one that convinced the FDA to approve Bidel for self-identified Black people. The first problem is that the study didn't test whether or not the drug is more effective in Black people compared to white people or brown people. The study just looked at whether or not the combination drug was an effective intervention compared to not using it. Now, despite not showing any treatment outcome difference that correlates with some measure of ancestry, marketing Bidel as a drug designed for a specific race assumes that there are biological differences in Black people that make this drug more effective for them. But to repeat myself, that isn't actually what the study demonstrated. Now, the second problem that arises from marketing the drug as specific for Black people is that the doctor, the drug company, and the FDA are implying that the different rates of deaths that result from heart attacks is different. It results from differences in the biology of people with darkly pigmented skin compared to people with lightly pigmented skin. Now, you just saw data that demonstrate higher death rates from cardiovascular disease as poverty rates increase. And as you saw, you also saw data showing that poverty rates are double the rate for white people, that poverty rates are double for Black people what they are for white people in the United States. So what is more likely? That the higher mortality from heart rates in a population of people is from their much higher rates of poverty or from their higher levels of pigmentation? There's a book that was published back in 2004. It was a piece of just spectacular investigative journalism by a guy named Jonathan Cahn, and he investigated the origins and the FDA approval of Bidel. And he really had 3 points that he brought up in this book. One is that the evidence of effectiveness was not compared to non-Blacks. He also raised a lot of red flags about the patents, and that the patents for the drugs were expiring, and basically these drug companies were looking for a new innovation that they could hold on to, that they could create a new patent and make more money as those other patents were expiring. And then he also brings up the point of poverty and racism, and that these really influence cardiovascular health. So cardiovascular health is affected by things that are not actually genetic. So he argues that Bidel is an example of a conflation, of conflating biological race with the social reality of racism. So I pulled out a quote out of his book. He said, well, out of an article that summarized many of the major points in his book. He says that at work here is an appropriation of race to serve larger political agendas aimed at transmuting health disparities rooted in social and economic inequality into mere health differences rooted in biology and genetics. And so there are people who worry that the way that Bidel was marketed basically lets people off the hook. It lets our society off the hook for the true reasons that you see this higher mortality rate in Black populations from heart attacks. The true reasons are the poverty or the stress from racism, not from genetics, and not from these physiological differences that correspond to that. I mean, the drugs make it seem like it's difference in biology, but the differences between those populations, they're not rooted in genetics. They're rooted in the way those people are treated in the United States. And with that, we come to the end.